What would you do if the world left you with nothing but a ruin? If all you had to your name was a pile of stone and timber that everyone, from the local squire to your own weary heart, had already dismissed as worthless? This was the inheritance of Martha Cole, a woman of 68 years, who in 1862 traded a lifetime of service for the deed to a single, derelict dower house called Blackwood End. The price was her silence, the property a joke. But the truth waiting inside that crumbling cottage, beneath a single loose floorboard, was a story the entire county had long forgotten. So settle in, find a comfortable chair, and let us know in the comments where, in the world you're watching from tonight, as we return to a muddy lane in the west of England, where a tired woman and her old dog have just come home to a place that is anything but. The cartwheel sank into a rut with a groan of wet wood, jolting Martha Cole from a half-slumber. She blinked, her eyes gritty with fatigue and the road's dust, and pulled the thin wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. Outside the cart's canvas flap, the world was a uniform gray. A low, weeping mist clung to the hedgerows, turning the vibrant greens of late autumn into a muted, sorrowful wash. Every leaf seemed to drip, and the air itself felt heavy, sodden with a melancholy that mirrored her own. Her companion, an old mongrel named Buster, whose grizzled muzzle rested on her knee, gave a low whine, his brown eyes fixed on her face as if to ask if this was truly their destination. Martha offered no answer, only a slow, rhythmic stroke along his back. There were no answers left to give. They had been on the road for 2 days, leaving behind the small, tied cottage that had been her home for 40 years. It had ceased to be her home the moment her husband, Thomas, had drawn his last breath. The notice from the estate had been polite but firm. The cottage was for a working man. A widow was not a working man. It was all quite simple, really. Her nephew, a man with soft hands and a hard face, had overseen the arrangements. He had spoken of her duty to the family, which seemed to mean effacing herself as quietly as possible. He had arranged the sale of her furniture, the dispersal of her few keepsakes. He had presented her with the deed to Blackwood End as if it were an act of profound charity. "It has been in the family for generations, Aunt Martha," he'd said, his voice slick with false piety. "It is only right that you should have it." He did not mention that it had been uninhabitable for 50 years. He did not mention that the roof had fallen in, that the village used its fallen stones for their garden walls. He simply handed her the parchment, a purse with a few shillings for her journey, and washed his hands of her. The cart, driven by a silent young man from a neighboring parish, who had agreed to the fare for a price that made her flinch, rounded a final bend. "This be it, missus," he muttered, not looking at her. "Blackwood End." He pointed with his whip towards a dark shape half hidden by a stand of skeletal oak trees. It was less a house and more a wound in the landscape. What should have been a welcoming country lane was a boggy track, choked with nettles and brambles that clawed at the sides of the cart. The gate sagged on a single rusted hinge, barred by a fallen branch as thick as a man's waist. Beyond it, the silhouette of the dower house slumped against the bruised sky. It was smaller than she remembered from her girlhood visits, and infinitely more pathetic. One wing of the slate roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged maw open to the elements. Ivy, thick and black, consumed the stone walls, its tendrils probing the window frames like fingers searching for a way in. The place did not look empty. It looked devoured. Buster whined again, a higher, more anxious note this time, and pressed his body closer to her leg. Martha felt a cold knot of despair tighten in her stomach, a feeling so familiar it was almost a comfort. This was it, the final chapter. A forgotten woman in a forgotten house, waiting for the damp and the dark to claim them both. The cart driver, eager to be done with this cheerless place, began to unhitch his horse, leaving her and her meager pile of belongings on the edge of the overgrown track, facing the ruin that was now her entire world. The young man had unloaded her few possessions: a tin trunk, a roll of bedding, a box of kitchen essentials, and a small crate of books her husband had cherished, and left without a backward glance, his cartwheels churning mud as he hastened back toward the world of the living. Martha stood alone in the encroaching twilight, the silence broken only by the drip of water from the trees and the soft pant of the old dog at her side. She looked at the house. The house seemed to look back, its vacant window spaces like hollow eyes. It was a monument to decay, a testament to time's slow, inexorable victory. For a long moment she simply stood there, a small, gray figure against a landscape of gray, feeling the full weight of her 68 years. She had survived the loss of her parents, a stillborn child, and now her husband of 4 decades. She had weathered poverty, illness, and the quiet condescension of those more fortunate. But this final insult of a home that was no home at all felt like a blow from which she might not recover. A cold rain began to fall, not a storm, but a persistent, miserable drizzle that promised to last the night. She took a deep breath of the damp air, a breath that felt like swallowing earth. Then, with a resolve born of pure necessity, she picked up her trunk in one hand, rested the other on the dog's solid head, and took the first step toward the sagging door of Blackwood End. Had she made a terrible mistake, accepting this ruin as her fate? Could any life be made in a place so utterly abandoned by warmth and care? What secrets lay sleeping under the dust and decay of half a century? Let us know what you would have done in her place, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet discovery. The door had not been opened in 50 years, and what Martha found inside was not the emptiness she expected, but a silence that felt solid, watchful. The door resisted at first, its oak swollen tight in the frame. Martha had to put her shoulder to it, pushing with the surprising, wiry strength that years of farm labor had ground into her bones. It gave way with a shriek of tortured iron and a puff of dust so thick it made her choke. The air that billowed out was cold and ancient, a smell of damp stone, powdered plaster, and the faint, sweet scent of rot. She stepped across the threshold, Buster trotting nervously at her heels, his claws clicking on the flagstones. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows. Moonlight, thin and watery, struggled through the grime of a high, arched window, illuminating a world of gray. A grand staircase, or what was left of it, swept upwards into darkness, its banister furred with a pale green mold and half its balusters missing. Cobwebs, thick as spun wool, hung from the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers. Everything was coated in a fine, uniform layer of dust, a soft gray blanket that smoothed all edges and muffled all sound. A single rat, disturbed by their entry, scurried across the floor and vanished into a hole in the wainscoting. Buster gave a low growl, but did not give chase. The house was too big, too strange. The loyal friend who had brought her, John Hemlock, the village blacksmith, followed her in, carrying the heavy box of kitchen things as if it weighed nothing. He was a man of few words, his face grimed with the soot of his trade, but his eyes were kind. He set the box down with a thud that echoed in the cavernous space. "Well, Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's solid." It was the best he could offer. He looked around, his practical gaze taking in the collapsed ceiling in the adjoining parlor, the dark water stains spreading down the walls. "There's one room at the back, the old keeping room. The roof looks tightest there. We'll put your things in." He didn't ask if she was staying. He knew she had nowhere else to go. For the next hour they worked in near silence, moving her few belongings into the small, stone-flagged room off the main kitchen. It had a huge blackened fireplace, a stone sink, and a single window that looked out onto a wilderness of tangled briars that had once been a garden. It was small, dark, and cold, but the ceiling was intact. It was defensible. John used his heavy hammer to board up the broken panes in the window and helped her wedge the door to the main house shut, creating a small sanctuary against the vastness of the ruin. When they were done, he stood by the door, his cap in his hands. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "See how you've settled. Bring you some firewood." Martha nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Thank you, John." "Nonsense," he grunted. "Thomas was a good man. You're one of ours." With that he was gone, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path, leaving her utterly alone. The silence that descended was different now. It was no longer the silence of an empty house, but the silence of a house with a single, beating heart in it. Hers, that night, she did not unpack. She unrolled her bedding on the floor in front of the cold hearth, as close to the center of the room as she could get. Buster curled up beside her, his warm, solid body a small anchor in the ocean of cold. Martha lay awake for hours, listening. The house was not quiet. It groaned and sighed around her, the wind whistling through the broken slates, the drip, drip, drip of water in a distant room, a maddening clockwork. It was the sound of a great beast dying, and she was trapped in its belly. She closed her eyes and saw her husband's face, not as he was at the end, but as a young man, his eyes full of laughter. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair. The ruin had claimed her. She was sure of it. The next morning Martha went into the village. It was a journey of necessity, for she had only a few scraps of bread and cheese left, but it felt like a trial. The village of Oakhaven was nestled in a shallow valley, a cluster of stone cottages and a Norman church, looking for all the world like a picture in a book. But the beauty of the place was lost on her. To her, it was a gauntlet of memory and judgment. She had grown up here, but she had been gone for a long time, and the faces she passed were mostly strangers. They stared. She knew what they saw: a stooped old woman in a worn black dress, her face a mask of grief and exhaustion, the new inhabitant of the local folly. Their whispers followed her like a flock of starlings. "That's her, the one at Blackwood End. Poor soul, hasn't she any family? Madness, I tell you. The place is cursed." She kept her eyes fixed on the path before her back straight, her expression unreadable. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. At the general store, a bell tinkling as she entered, she felt the conversation halt. The shopkeeper, a portly man she didn't recognize, eyed her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. As she was counting out her coins for a small loaf and a packet of tea, a loud, booming voice filled the shop. "Well, well, if it isn't the new lady of the manor, making a palace of the old ruin. Are we, Mrs. Cole?" Squire Pembroke stood in the doorway, a large, florid man whose wealth was as new as his waistcoat was loud. He had bought the main estate 5 years prior, and with it, the contempt of the old families. He was the one who had technically owned Blackwood End, the one who had been all too happy to sign it over to her nephew to settle a small debt. To him, Martha was not a person, but a piece of inconvenient history he had tidied away. He laughed, a short barking sound that held no humor. "I trust you're finding the accommodations to your liking. Plenty of fresh air, I imagine." The other patrons in the shop shuffled their feet, some offering a weak, sycophantic chuckle, others staring at the floorboards, ashamed. Martha met his gaze, her own eyes as gray and still as a winter sea. She said nothing. Her silence was a vacuum that his bluster could not fill. He flushed slightly, annoyed at her refusal to be baited or broken. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning to the shopkeeper. "A bottle of my usual claret, man, and be quick about it." Martha paid for her goods and left, the bell tinkling her departure. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, but the air was still cold. As she turned to walk back towards the lane, a hand, thin and dry as a dead leaf, touched her arm. She started, turning to see a very old woman, wrapped in a black shawl so faded it was nearly gray. It was Mrs. Gable, who had been a scullery maid at the great house when Martha was just a girl. Her face was a fine web of wrinkles, but her eyes were startlingly clear. "Don't you mind him?" the old woman whispered, her voice a reedy rasp. "Men like that, they see the price of everything and the value of nothing." She leaned closer, her grip surprisingly strong. Blackwood End has its own memory, she said, her voice dropping lower still. Some roots run deeper than stone. And with that she released Martha's arm, gave a small, firm nod, and shuffled away down a side alley, leaving Martha standing in the middle of the village square, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. Some roots run deeper than stone. What could she possibly mean? Martha returned to the cold keeping room, the squire's mockery ringing in her ears and Mrs. Gable's strange pronouncement a puzzle in her heart. She put her meager purchases on the rough wooden table that, along with a single chair, constituted her furniture. The fire John had promised was there, a small but welcome pile of logs and kindling stacked neatly by the hearth. She knelt and, with numb fingers, set about building a fire, the little acts of survival. Laying the paper, adding the sticks, striking the match, were a comfort. They were real, they were tasks she could accomplish. The fire caught with a satisfying roar, and for the first time a flicker of warmth, of life, pushed back against the oppressive chill of the house. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in the chair, Buster's head once more on her knee, and watched the flames. The house was still a ruin. Her future was still a terrifying void. But in this one small room, for this one small moment, there was a fire. It was a start. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity and the slow turning of the earth. Martha's life became a cycle of simple, arduous tasks. Each morning she would rise at dawn, her breath fogging in the cold air, and fetch water from the old well in the courtyard. The winch was rusted and stiff, and it took all her strength to draw the bucket up, but the water was clear and cold. She spent her days in a constant battle against the decay. She swept away decades of dust and leaves, scrubbed the flagstones until her knees ached, and used old rags to plug the drafts that whistled through every crack and crevice. She worked not with any hope of restoration, but simply to carve out a livable space, to hold the wilderness at bay. Buster was her constant shadow, a silent, watchful presence. He would lie on a piece of sacking by the fire while she worked indoors, or trot beside her as she explored the immediate grounds, his nose twitching at the scent of rabbits and foxes. He never strayed far. It was as if he, too, understood that this small island of human endeavor was their only refuge. The house itself remained a formidable, unknowable entity. She kept the door to the main hall firmly shut, living her life entirely within the confines of the keeping room and the adjoining scullery. But she could not ignore the rest of the building. It was always there, looming over her. At night, she would lie in her bed and listen to its symphony of decline. A loose slate sliding from the roof, the scuttling of unseen creatures in the walls, the mournful sigh of the wind through the shattered conservatory. Sometimes she would hear a loud crash from a distant wing as a plaster ceiling or a rotten beam finally gave up its long struggle. In those moments, the house felt alive, a wounded giant groaning in its sleep. She was not afraid, not in the way a younger woman might be. Her fear was a deeper, quieter thing. It was the fear of being absorbed, of letting the house's decay become her own, of simply sitting down one day and allowing the dust to settle on her too. So she kept moving, she kept working. The labor was her prayer, her protest against the dying of the light. She was not reclaiming the house, she was simply refusing to be claimed by it. A strange and silent truce settled between them. The house would continue its slow crumble, and she would be permitted to live in one small corner of it, a hermit crab in a vast, decaying shell. One afternoon, as a pale sun broke through the clouds, she decided to tackle the keeping room floor. It was made of wide, rough-hewn planks, stained dark with age and grime. She took her bucket of hot water and a stiff-bristled brush and got down on her hands and knees. It was grueling work, but as she scrubbed, she began to notice the details of the room for the first time. She saw the marks of the adzes on the great ceiling beam, the faint outline of a child's handprint scratched into the plaster by the fire. A ghost of a life lived here long before her. As she worked her way across the floor, her brush passed over one board near the hearth that made a different sound, not the solid thud of the others, but a dull, slightly hollow echo. She stopped, resting back on her heels. She ran her hand over it. The wood felt different too. Smother, she looked closer. The other boards were pine, rough and full of knots. This one was oak, its grain finer, its color a shade richer beneath the dirt. It was shorter than the others too, running perpendicular to the main floor, as if it had been put in as a patch. But why use a superior wood for a patch? Why go to the trouble? Buster, who had been dozing by the fire, got up and patted over. He sniffed intently at the seam of the oak board, then looked up at her, his tail giving a single questioning thump against the floor. Martha frowned. It was an anomaly, a detail that refused to fit, a wrong note in the symphony of decay. She told herself it was nothing, just a shoddy repair by a long-dead workman with a piece of scrap wood. She had more important things to worry about. The dwindling woodpile, the leak in her boot, the coming winter. She finished scrubbing the floor, rinsed her brush, and set about making her supper. But as she sat by the fire that evening, her eyes kept drifting back to the single oak board. It sat there in the middle of her small, ordered world, a quiet, insistent question. The question of the oak board lingered in the back of Martha's mind for days, a small, persistent burr. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy, and she tried to dismiss it. There was real work to be done. John Hemlock had been true to his word, appearing every few days with a barrow of firewood, a rabbit from his snares, or a piece of news from the village. He never stayed long, but his quiet solidarity was a lifeline. He helped her patch the worst of the holes in the keeping room roof with salvaged slate, a job that left them both exhausted and filthy, but her small living space significantly drier. She spent a week clearing a path through the tangled briars to the old stone wall at the back of the property, discovering a forgotten gate that led to a small copse of apple trees, their fruit small and bitter but usable for cider. Her hands, already calloused, became harder still, her face weathered by the wind and sun. She was becoming a part of the landscape, as rough and resilient as the ancient stones of the house itself. Yet the board drew her back. In the quiet moments, when the fire was low and Buster was dreaming at her feet, she would find herself staring at it. It was the neatness of it that was so unsettling. The rest of the house was a testament to chaos and collapse. But this one board was fitted with a carpenter's precision, its edges true, its placement deliberate. It was a pocket of order in a universe of entropy. One rainy afternoon, when the weather had driven her indoors and the oppressive damp seemed to seep into her very bones, she could ignore it no longer. The feeling was not one of curiosity, but of a strange, nagging duty. The board wanted to be seen. It was waiting for her. She went to the small wooden chest that held the few tools John had given her. A hammer, a handful of nails, a rusty saw, and a heavy iron pry bar. She picked up the pry bar. It felt cold and purposeful in her hand. Buster, sensing a change in the room's atmosphere, lifted his head. His ears pricked. She knelt beside the board, the iron bar a heavy weight. For a moment she hesitated. This felt like a violation. For weeks, she had lived in a state of truce with the house, respecting its boundaries, asking nothing of it but shelter. To do this, to pry into its secrets, felt like a betrayal of that fragile peace. What if she was wrong? What if it was just a board, and she would be left with a hole in her floor and the knowledge of her own foolishness? She looked around the small room, her bedroll, her single chair, her husband's books stacked neatly in the corner. This was her life now. What was the worst that could happen? She had already lost everything that mattered. With a sigh that was half prayer, half surrender, she wedged the tip of the pry bar into the thin crack between the oak and the surrounding pine. She put her weight on it. The old wood groaned in protest. Nothing happened. The board was seated too tightly. She repositioned the bar, finding a better purchase, and pushed down again, leveraging her entire body. A sharp crack echoed in the silence. Splinters flew, but the board held firm. This was not a simple repair. This board had been put here to stay. The resistance, more than anything, solidified her resolve. Something that was this difficult to undo had been done for a reason. Sweat beaded on her brow. She worked the bar back and forth, slowly, patiently, widening the crack millimeter by millimeter. Buster got to his feet and began to pace, whining softly, his nails clicking a nervous rhythm on the stone hearth. The house seemed to be holding its breath around them. With a final, desperate heave, the nails holding the board gave way with a succession of sharp, screeching pops. The oak plank came loose with such suddenness that Martha stumbled backward, the pry bar clattering to the floor. She knelt on the dusty floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs, and peered into the darkness. There was a cavity beneath, about a foot square, lined with what looked like decaying canvas. The air that rose from it was dry and musty, different from the damp smell of the rest of the house. It smelled of time itself. Her hands trembled as she reached into the opening. Her fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and round. She drew it out into the dim light of the room. It lay in the palm of her grimy hand, heavy and solid, its surface glowing with a soft, dull luster that seemed to absorb the firelight. It was a coin, a gold sovereign, its face bearing the profile of a king she dimly remembered from her history lessons as a girl. It was not dropped. It was not lost. It had been placed there, nestled in the dark, waiting. It was a single, deliberate word in a conversation she was only just beginning to understand. The sovereign felt impossibly heavy in her palm, a small, dense sun in the gloom of the keeping room. It was not the value of the coin that stunned her into silence, though she knew it represented more money than she had seen in a decade. It was the intentionality of it. This was no accident. This was a marker, a signpost left by an unknown hand for an unknown traveler, and she had just arrived. Her breath came in ragged bursts. Buster, sensing the magnitude of the moment, came and nuded her hand with his wet nose, then licked the back of it, a gesture of simple, uncomplicated comfort. She closed her fingers around the coin, its milled edge a sharp, grounding reality. Someone had gone to great trouble to hide this, and to hide it in a way that it might one day be found by someone patient enough or desperate enough to look. Mrs. Gable's words came back to her. Some roots run deeper than stone. Her gaze, now sharp with a purpose she hadn't felt in years, scanned the area around the hole. The coin was the start, but it could not be the end. It pointed to something. Her eyes fell upon the great stone hearth. The board had been placed next to it, almost touching the brickwork. It was an old fireplace, deep and wide enough to roast an ox, with a simple stone lintel and bricks around. It was black with the soot of 1,000 fires. But now she saw it not as a fireplace, but as a structure. She ran her hands over the bricks beside the opening in the floor. They were cold, solid. She tapped them with her knuckles. Thud, thud, thud. Then, a little higher up, just at eye level, one brick gave a different sound. A hollow, papery sound. Her heart leaped. She took the pry bar again, its weight familiar now, an extension of her will. With a surgeon's care, she inserted the tip into the mortar around the odd-sounding brick. The mortar was different, softer, crumbling to dust under the pressure. It was not the original lime mortar of the house. It was a later, cruder mixture of sand and dirt. The brick came loose easily, and she pulled it out. Behind it was not more brick, but darkness. A draft of cold, still air, smelling of dust and dry paper, flowed out, chilling her face and making the fire on the hearth flicker and dance. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely function. She lit a tallow candle, its small flame a brave yellow star against the encroaching mystery. Shielding it with one hand, she held it to the opening. The light fell upon a small, dark space, a void carved into the heart of the chimney breast. And in that space, something was waiting. It was a small, iron-bound strongbox, its surface thick with the dust of ages. It was not large, no bigger than a loaf of bread, but it was locked. Beside it, propped against the side of the hidden cavity, was a single folded sheet of parchment, sealed with a blob of dark red wax. With trembling fingers, Martha reached in and retrieved the parchment first. The wax seal was stamped with a signet she had never seen before. A stylized oak tree, its roots and branches intertwined. She broke the seal. The parchment was brittle, and she unfolded it with infinite care. The ink was faded to a rusty brown, the handwriting an elegant, spidery script. It was not a letter. It was a list of instructions. "To whom finds this," it began. "The key is the coin. The coin is the key. Seek the cellar of keeping. Below the room that is not a room. Let stewardship be your guide, not greed. The room that is not a room?" The words made no sense. She turned her attention back to the strongbox. It was heavy. She brought it out and placed it on the floor. The lock was ornate, made of brass, now green with verdigris. There was a keyhole, but also a strange, circular indentation in the center of the lid. She looked at the sovereign in her other hand. The key is the coin. Her mind reeled. She took the gold coin and placed it into the indentation. It was a perfect fit. With a soft click, a hidden mechanism engaged, and a small, almost invisible seam appeared on the front of the box. It wasn't a lock to be picked. It was a puzzle to be solved. The front panel swung open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single heavy iron key, and beneath it a small leather-bound ledger. She took the key. It felt ancient, powerful. Then she picked up the ledger. The leather was dry and cracked, but the book was intact. She opened it to the first page. In the same elegant script as the note, it read, "The accounts and holdings of the Blackwood estate in trust. Anno Domini 1789. The book was filled with page after page of meticulous entries. Records of rents, lists of assets, deeds to land, and notes on the storage of family valuables in a place referred to only as the cellar. The final entry, dated 1812, was chilling. "The world has turned to madness," it read. "The new men care only for gold, not for the land. We go into a long winter. I have made the house ready. I have sealed the door. May God grant that one of our own blood, or one with a true heart, should one day find the way back." It was signed Eleanor Cole, her great-aunt. The room that is not a room. It was the hidden cavity itself, and if the ledger was to be believed, somewhere beneath her feet, beneath the floor of this very room, lay a cellar that had been sealed for 50 years. Just as the enormity of her discovery began to settle upon her, the wind, which had been rising all evening, slammed against the house with the force of a physical blow. A sudden, violent torrent of rain hammered against the roof and the boarded window. A loud crack, like a gunshot, echoed from the main part of the house, followed by the sound of shattering glass and splintering timber. The truce was over. A great autumn storm, the kind that could strip trees bare and turn roads into rivers, had descended upon Blackwood End. Martha scrambled to her feet, the ledger clutched to her chest. She looked at the hole in the floor, the opening in the chimney, the iron key in her hand. She had found the map, but now a hurricane was threatening to tear it to pieces. And through the howling of the wind, she heard another sound, faint but unmistakable. A desperate human cry for help from the track outside. The storm was a living thing, a ravenous beast of wind and water. It threw itself at the old house, shaking it to its very foundations. Rain lashed down in solid sheets, driven horizontally by a gale that shrieked and moaned through the broken slates and empty window frames. Martha's newly patched roof over the keeping room was holding, but the rest of the house was being torn apart. Another crash, this one closer, told her a chimney stack had given way. The frantic cry from outside came again, closer this time, a man's voice, raw with desperation, nearly swallowed by the gale. "Help, please, is anyone there?" Martha hesitated for only a second. Her instinct was to bar the door, to protect her newfound secret, to retreat into the safety of her small fire-lit space. But the sound was one of pure terror, the cry of a soul at the end of its rope. Thomas would have gone out. Her Thomas, who never turned away a soul in need, would have already been pulling on his boots. Taking a deep breath, she placed the precious ledger and the iron key carefully into her dry tin trunk, covered the hole into the floor with the oak board, and grabbed her heaviest shawl. Wrestling with the heavy back door, she finally managed to pull it open a few inches, just enough to peer out. The world was a maelstrom of blackness and flying debris. In the intermittent flashes of lightning, she could see the scene on the lane. A small, canvas-topped cart had overturned, one of its wheels shattered. A horse stood nearby, trembling, its eyes wide with fear. A man was struggling to free something or someone. From the wreckage, his clothes plastered to his body, his shouts lost to the wind. Martha didn't think. She acted. She grabbed her candle lantern, lit it, and shielding its precious flame with her body, plunged out into the storm. The wind nearly tore the door from her hand, and the rain soaked her to the skin in an instant. Buster, barking furiously, followed at her heels. "Here," she yelled, her voice a thin thread against the roar. "Over here!" The man turned, his face a pale blur in the gloom. He saw the light. Hope. He gestured wildly back toward the cart. "My wife and my boy. He's burning with fever." It took the two of them, straining with all their might, to force the cart up enough for the woman and child to crawl out. The woman was weeping, half from fear, half from relief. The boy, wrapped in a sodden blanket, was frighteningly still, his skin hot to the touch. They were traveling tinkers, the man explained in ragged gasps, caught on the road between towns when the storm hit. They had seen the faint glimmer of her fire, a single point of light in the overwhelming darkness. Getting them into the house was another battle against the elements. But at last, they were inside, huddled and dripping on the flagstones of her keeping room. The woman, whose name was Rose, collapsed into the single chair, her body racked with shivers. The man, Ben, stood helplessly, looking at his sick son. The boy, no more than 7, was delirious, muttering nonsense, his breathing shallow. Martha took charge. The discovery in the chimney, the promise of the cellar, all of it receded. There was a life to be saved. "Get those wet things off," she commanded, her voice firm. She pulled her own dry bedding from its roll and wrapped it around the mother and child. She stoked the fire until it blazed, filling the small room with a fug of heat and steam. She brewed the last of her tea, lacing it with a splash of the precious whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. She bathed the boy's face with cool water from the well, murmuring soft, soothing words as her own mother had done for her decades ago. For the rest of that long night, the 4 of them, and the dog, were a small, beleaguered garrison holding out against the storm. Ben, the father, helped Martha secure a loose shutter that was banging against the wall like a drum. Rose, her own fear submerged by her maternal terror, held her son, singing quietly to him. And Martha, moving between the fire and the sickbed, was the calm center. She shared her small loaf of bread and the last of her cheese. She gave them her warmth, her space, her meager resources, without a second thought. At one point, in the darkest hour before dawn, the boy's breathing grew alarmingly faint. Martha, her face grim, crushed a clove of garlic and some herbs from her dwindling supply and made a steaming poultice for his chest. It was an old remedy, one she had not used in years. She did not know if it would work. She could only try. As she tended to the boy, she was no longer Martha Cole, the forgotten widow. She was a woman with a purpose, defending life against the chaos that raged outside. The house, her secret, her potential fortune. It was all secondary. In that moment, she was choosing. She was choosing to protect the fragile flicker of a child's life over the cold, hard promise of gold. It was a test, and she was passing it. By dawn, the storm had broken. A weak, watery sunlight filtered into the room, illuminating a scene of quiet exhaustion. The boy's fever had broken. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep, and even his mother asleep in the chair beside him, her hand resting on his forehead. Ben, the father, sat on the floor by the fire, his head bowed. Whether in prayer or sleep, Martha could not tell. Buster lay stretched out on the hearth, snoring softly. The house was quiet except for the steady drip of water from a dozen new leaks. Martha stood and looked at the strangers she had taken in. In sheltering them, she had reaffirmed her own humanity. She had chosen community over isolation, life over dust. She walked over to the tin trunk and gently lifted the lid. The ledger and the iron key were still there, safe and dry. She had protected them too. She had protected the past and the present, all in one long, dark night. She had proven herself a worthy steward. Now it was time to claim her inheritance. The week that followed was one of quiet, purposeful action. Ben, a skilled woodworker and smith by trade, was overcome with gratitude. He insisted on repaying Martha's kindness not with coin, which he did not have, but with his labor. While Rose and the now recovering young Tomos helped Martha clear the garden and scrub the main hall, Ben set to work. With a craftsman's eye, he assessed the damages the storm had wrought and began the long process of repair. He mended the broken cartwheel, but he also rehung the main door, fixed the collapsed chimney stack with salvaged bricks and fresh mortar, and, using timber from a fallen oak, began to systematically repair the gaping hole in the roof. The house, which had only known decay for 50 years, began to feel the touch of a caring hand once more. The sound of a hammer and saw, of a child's laughter in the garden, began to chase away the ghosts. During this time, Martha said nothing of her discovery. The ledger and key remained in her trunk. It was a secret she held close, a promise she was not yet ready to share. She needed to understand it herself before she could reveal it to the world. One afternoon, when the family was occupied, she took the ledger and the iron key and returned to the keeping room. She rolled back the rough rug she had placed over the area. There was no trapdoor visible, no ring or handle. She consulted the ledger again. The final entry was spare. Beneath the hearth lies the heart. She looked at the great stone hearth, the very foundation of the room. It seemed impossible. But the book had been right about everything else. Following a hunch, she measured the floorboards, using the dimensions of the hidden cavity as a guide. She found a spot not on the floor, but on the vertical stone face of the hearth's base, where one of the blocks of stone seemed to have a faint, almost invisible seam around it. She pressed it. Nothing. She pushed it. Nothing. Then she remembered the key. It was not a key for a door, but for a lock of a different kind. She found a small, nearly concealed hole in the center of the stone block, a keyhole filled with the dust of decades. With trembling hands, she inserted the great iron key. It slid in with a smooth, well-oiled precision. She turned it. There was a deep, grinding sound from within the wall, the sound of stone moving against stone, of gears that had not turned in half a century engaging. The stone block receded slightly, and then, with a push, it swung inward, revealing a set of steep, narrow stone steps leading down into absolute darkness. The air that rose to meet her was cold, dry, and utterly still. It was the air of a tomb, but a clean one. She lit her lantern, took a deep breath, and descended. The steps were slick with a fine layer of dust, but were solid. 10 steps down, they opened into a small, barrel-vaulted cellar, no larger than the keeping room above it. But it was not empty. The lantern light reflected off a scene of breathtaking order. Against one wall were stacked dozens of wooden crates, their lids sealed with wax. On shelves carved into the stone sat rows of silver platters, goblets and candlesticks, each meticulously wrapped in linen, now yellowed with age. Against the far wall were several heavy iron-strapped chests. Martha approached the nearest crate and, using her pry bar, gently broke the seal. She lifted the lid. The crate was filled to the brim with gold and silver coins, each one layered between sheets of waxed paper. It was a fortune, a king's ransom. But it was the contents of the iron chests that truly took her breath away. They were not filled with treasure, but with something far more valuable. They contained deeds, titles, and charters, bound in leather and tied with ribbon. They were the legal proof of the Cole family's ownership and stewardship of not just Blackwood End, but of hundreds of acres of surrounding farmland, woodland, and cottages. Lands that had been slowly, and she now realized, illegally absorbed into the Pembroke estate over the last 50 years. Her great-aunt had not just hidden the family's wealth, she had hidden its very identity, its legacy, its proof of being. A few days later, a smart carriage pulled up the newly cleared lane to Blackwood End. A man in a dark, well-tailored suit stepped out. This was Mr. Davies, a solicitor from the county town, a man known for his discretion and his sharp legal mind. Martha had sent for him via a message carried by Ben. Mr. Davies was polite but visibly skeptical as Martha, a poor widow in a patched dress, led him into the dower house. His skepticism turned to curiosity when she showed him the sovereign, then to professional interest when he saw the ledger, and finally to stunned silence when she led him down the stone steps into the cellar of keeping. He spent 2 hours in the cellar, his spectacles perched on his nose, examining the deeds and charters under the light of Martha's lantern. He said very little, only indeed, and remarkable and perfectly preserved. When he finally ascended the steps, his face was grimly triumphant. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice imbued with a new respect. "This is extraordinary. These documents are impeccably preserved and legally binding. The chain of title is unbroken." He looked at her, a quiet, unassuming woman standing in a ruined house. "It would seem," he said with a small, dry smile, "that you are one of the wealthiest landowners in this county, and that Squire Pembroke is your tenant." The final scene was not a confrontation, but a quiet, formal meeting in the newly cleaned main hall of Blackwood End. Sunlight streamed through the tall, grime-free windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A fire crackled in the hearth. Mr. Davies had arranged it all. Squire Pembroke arrived, his face a thunderous mask of confusion and indignation. He saw Martha, Ben's family in the garden, and Mr. Davies waiting with a stack of parchments on a makeshift table. He began to bluster, but Mr. Davies cut him off with a raised hand. "Squire," the solicitor said, his voice calm and level, "we have some estate matters to discuss." For the next hour, Mr. Davies laid out the evidence, piece by irrefutable piece. He presented the original charters, the unbroken ledgers, the deeds signed and sealed by Pembroke's own predecessors. He explained in dry legal terms that the lands Pembroke had thought were his had, in fact, been held in an unrecorded trust, a trust which had now come to light, with Martha Cole as its sole heir and executor. Pembroke's florid face went from red to purple, then to a sickly, mottled white. He was a man built on the foundations of money and power, and he had just watched the ground crumble beneath him. He looked at Martha, truly looked at her for the first time, not as a pitiable old woman, but as the architect of his undoing. He saw no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, only a quiet, weary resolve. He had been beaten, not by a rival, but by history itself. To his credit, he did not rage. The fight went out of him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper, directed at Martha. Martha looked at him, then at the deeds on the table, then out the window at the land, her land. "I want my tenants to be treated fairly," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I want the cottages repaired. I want the rents to be just. This was never about punishing you, Squire. It was about honoring a duty." Mr. Davies then proposed a solution, one he and Martha had already discussed. Pembroke would not be evicted. He would repurchase the lands from the Cole estate at a fair market value, with contracts ensuring the rights and protections of the tenant farmers. It was not ruin, but it was a profound humbling. He would be a landowner, but he would no longer be a king, he agreed. Word of the meeting, of the solicitor's carriage, of the squire's pale face upon leaving, spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. The whispers in the village changed their tune. Mockery turned to awe, and awe to a deep, abiding respect. Martha Cole, the madwoman of the ruin, had become the quiet, unshakable heart of the county. Months passed. The transaction was completed. Blackwood End was no longer a ruin, but a work in progress. With the funds from the land sale, Martha had hired local craftsmen, overseen by Ben, to restore the house not to a state of grandeur, but to one of sturdy, comfortable dignity. The collapsed wing was rebuilt. The roof was reslated. The windows were reglazed. The gardens were cleared and planted. It was a home again. Ben and his family offered a permanent position as caretakers, and a cottage of their own on the estate had stayed. The house was filled with life. One evening, in the soft golden light of late summer, Martha sat on a simple wooden bench in her newly planted rose garden. The air was sweet with the scent of climbing jasmine and freshly cut grass. Blackwood End stood before her, its warm stone glowing, its windows reflecting the sunset. It was peaceful. Buster, older and grayer now, lay at her feet, his head resting on her shoe. Young Tomos, a healthy, boisterous boy, ran up and presented her with a perfectly formed, deep red rose. "For you, Mrs. Cole," he said, beaming. She took it, her heart full. John Hemlock, the blacksmith, leaned on the new garden gate, his day's work done. "You did it, Martha," he said, his voice full of quiet pride. "You brought it back." Martha looked from the house to the land stretching out beyond it, to the faces of the people who now depended on her. She thought of the gold in the cellar, which she had not touched, and the ledgers, which she read every night. "It was never about finding a fortune," she said, her voice barely a whisper on the evening air. "It was about remembering a duty." The real treasure had not been the coin, but the stewardship it represented. The gold was just a key, and the house was just a box. The inheritance was the responsibility, a legacy of care she had unknowingly been searching for her entire life, and had finally found in the heart of a ruin. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Martha's story. It's a powerful reminder that true wealth is often found not in what we acquire, but in what we choose to protect. It's a story about the quiet power of stewardship. If you were moved by her journey, please consider leaving a like and a comment below, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and unexpected grace. Our next story takes us to the windswept coast, where a young lighthouse keeper finds a message in a bottle that will change the fate of an entire village. Until then, be well.